A luxurious flight takes an unexpected turn when a wealthy white woman demands silence from a black family traveling in first class, setting off a quiet storm of tension high above the clouds. Madison Oakley, a composed and dignified mother, does her best to shield her children from the passive-aggressive hostility brewing just a row ahead. But as judgmental glances turn into sharp words and privilege begins to unravel under pressure, someone unexpected decides to step in. What happens when the person you least expect speaks the loudest, without ever raising their voice? Linda Brewster's nails clicked sharply against her phone screen as she tapped, swiped, and sighed loud enough for anyone within 10 feet to hear. She stood stiffly in the premium lounge of Monarch Airlines, shifting her designer tote from one arm to the other with a theatrical grunt. Her eyes swept across the room like a security camera on high alert, searching for offense, scanning for anyone who didn't belong. And then she saw them. A black woman, tall and confident, dressed in a soft gray wrap sweater over dark jeans, sat with her legs crossed at the ankle. She was reading something on a tablet. Quiet, focused, graceful. Beside her sat a man, probably her husband, with broad shoulders and a calm smile, gently correcting the posture of their young son as he bounced slightly on the lounge chair. A girl, maybe 10 or 11, leaned into the woman's side, whispering something while pointing out the window. Linda's nose twitched. "Oh, great," she muttered, just loud enough for a nearby lounge attendant to glance up, then look away. "I pay thousands to fly in peace, and now we're turning this into a daycare?" She didn't say it to anyone in particular, but she didn't need to. She made sure her words were delivered like perfume, light, lingering, and impossible to ignore. Then she turned her attention back to her phone and pretended to scroll, though her eyes flicked back to the family every few seconds. Watching, judging. Madison Oakley didn't look up. Not when Linda huffed, not when she clattered her toque loudly on the marble countertop nearby, and not when she whispered to the front desk about whether the lounge had changed their guest requirements. Madison was used to it, the performance, the sideways glances, the slow, deliberate reminder that no matter how well you dressed, no matter how quietly your children behaved, some people would still think you didn't belong. Elijah tugged at Madison's sleeve. "Mommy, are we still flying over the ocean first or the mountains?" Madison smiled, brushing a finger gently against his temple. "Mountains first, baby. Then a big stretch of water, all the way to the other side. Do we get to see the water? Maybe, if it's a clear day. Will it look like the globe?" Tyrone leaned in, smiling. "Exactly like the globe, just way bigger." Maya giggled and whispered something to her dad. Madison kept her eyes down, focused on calming her son's excitement with soft words and slower breaths. She knew the line between joyful children and disruptive could be razor-thin in places like this. Linda noticed the laughter. She leaned slightly toward the front counter, where a young man in a vest stood stiffly behind a computer. "Excuse me," she said, arching an eyebrow. "Is there any way to be moved to a quieter section? I specifically booked first class to avoid that." The attendant blinked. "Ma'am, this is the only premium lounge available. If you'd prefer a quieter corner, I can—" "It's not about the corner," she interrupted, dropping her voice as if speaking an ugly truth. "It's about the atmosphere." He said nothing, which was, Madison noted, the safest thing he could have done. Boarding was called 10 minutes later. As they lined up, Madison noticed the way Linda kept glancing behind her shoulder, craning to see who might be following her up the jet bridge. Tyrone simply squeezed Madison's hand and whispered, "Head high, as always." The cabin smelled like citrus oil and leather, the polished scent of wealth. The seats were wide, gleaming, and equipped with menus tucked into cream-colored leather pouches. Linda took her spot in the third row on the left side, placing her tote in the overhead bin with a grunt and immediately pulling out a silk scarf to drape over her shoulders like armor. Madison followed, with Maya and Elijah trailing beside her, whispering about seatbelts and window views. Tyrone lifted their carry-on into the overhead with ease and guided the kids into their row behind Linda. Linda's jaw tensed when she realized the family was seated directly behind her. Madison settled into her window seat, Elijah beside her, and Maya across the aisle next to Tyrone. The kids were already marveling at the glossy screen on the seat back, poking through movies and games. Their voices were low, respectful, but to Linda they might as well have been shouting. She let out a long sigh and shifted dramatically in her seat. Madison didn't look at her. She was busy fitting Elijah's headphones over his curls, adjusting the angle so they wouldn't slide off mid-flight. She gave him a reassuring nod and kissed the top of his head. Behind her, Linda snapped her fingers at the flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said, "can I have a glass of sparkling water before takeoff? And maybe—" She glanced over her shoulder with exaggerated concern. "Could someone remind passengers to be mindful of noise levels?" The flight attendant gave her a diplomatic smile. "Of course, ma'am. We'll be coming through with refreshments shortly." The older woman huffed, clearly unimpressed by the lack of immediate action. As the last few passengers trickled on board, Madison leaned her head back and closed her eyes for a moment. She hadn't even taken off yet, and already she could feel the edge of exhaustion pushing in. Not the kind that came from early morning travel or wrangling kids, but the kind that came from always having to soften yourself to make others comfortable. She opened her eyes to find Maya staring at her. The little girl whispered, "You okay, Mom?" Madison nodded and smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just tired." Maya offered her a tiny thumbs up before returning to her screen. From the row ahead, Linda shifted again. Her seat jolted slightly backward. Madison said nothing. She didn't sigh. She didn't react. Elijah accidentally tapped the back of Linda's seat with his sneaker while trying to adjust his legs. It was light, barely a graze. But Linda twisted around instantly, her eyes wide with performative disbelief. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "Some of us paid to relax." Madison met her gaze for the first time. There it was. The look. Not quite disgust, not quite fear, but a tangle of resentment and entitlement that clung to Linda's expression like old wallpaper. "I'm sorry," Madison said calmly. "He's just getting comfortable. We'll be sure to keep our space." "I would hope so," Linda replied, her voice clipped. "There are standards in first class. It's not a playground." Madison didn't answer. She just turned back toward her son and helped him cross his legs properly, her fingers steady even as her jaw clenched. Tyrone leaned across the aisle, his voice low and gentle. "You good?" Madison gave him a small nod. Same movie, different flight. He chuckled under his breath, but there was no humor in it. The plane taxied toward the runway. The safety video played. Maya giggled softly at the animated characters explaining how to inflate a life vest, and Elijah asked, whispering this time, if he could press the button to recline just a little. By the time the wheels lifted off the ground, Linda had already pressed her call button twice. Madison didn't say another word. She looked out the window as the clouds swallowed the plane, her hand resting gently on her son's back. She knew this flight would be longer than the miles it covered. She also knew, deep down, that something was coming, and this time she wouldn't be the one biting her tongue. Linda Brewster adjusted the scarf around her neck with a flourish, as though it were a badge of class. Her gaze darted to the aisle, then back over her shoulder again. Every time Madison's children whispered or giggled or shifted in their seats, Linda's shoulders stiffened. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't say anything, yet but the way she twisted in her seat after every tiny sound was loud enough. The aircraft leveled out, and the ding of the seatbelt sign turning off echoed softly through the cabin. A flight attendant passed by with warm towels and a tired smile. Tyrone accepted two and handed one to Madison. who pressed it against her face with a long exhale. Beside her, Elijah was quietly examining the in-flight map, his eyes wide at how far they still had to go. "Mom," he whispered, "are we over the mountains yet?" "Almost, baby," she murmured, leaning in to show him the outline of their path across the country. "See that little triangle? That's the Rockies." Elijah nodded solemnly, as though receiving sacred information. Linda's voice rang out suddenly, sharp and precise. "Can someone please remind the families in this section that this is not Coach?" A pause followed, a soft silence, the kind that hangs in the air when everyone hears something but pretends they didn't. Tyrone looked up. Madison didn't. Elijah froze, clutching the edge of his tray table. Maya, across the aisle, looked toward her father, her face uncertain. The flight attendant, a young woman with a bun tucked so tightly it looked painful, approached Linda with practiced composure. "Is there something I can help you with, ma'am?" "I booked this ticket for peace and quiet," Linda said, her voice steady but tight. "And instead, I've got constant chatter and—" she motioned vaguely behind her. "Restless feet in my back. Perhaps someone can do something before it becomes a bigger issue." The flight attendant glanced at Madison, who was still looking at the map with Elijah, her body perfectly still, her posture relaxed. Then she looked at Tyrone, who raised one eyebrow but said nothing. The attendant's smile was stiff as she turned back to Linda. "I'll be happy to offer you some noise-canceling headphones, ma'am." Linda frowned. "I don't need headphones. I need people to be courteous." Behind her, Madison finally looked up, locking eyes with the attendant for the briefest moment. There was no anger there, only a calm, steady patience that felt heavier than silence. The attendant hesitated. "I'll check with my lead and see what we can do." Madison turned her attention back to her son. "You okay?" she asked softly. Elijah nodded, but his lips were pressed into a line. "Want to switch seats? You can sit with Daddy if you'd feel better." "Now, I want to sit with you," he said. Then after a moment, "I wasn't being loud." "I know, sweetheart, you weren't." Across the aisle, Tyrone offered her a glance that said everything. "We're fine. Keep steady." But Madison's hands, now resting in her lap, had gone rigid. Linda pulled a sleep mask down over her eyes with dramatic flair and shifted in her seat again. And again. She pressed her seat recline button, then pushed back harder. Madison's tray trembled, her water bottle tipped over slightly. She didn't flinch. She knew what this was. Maya whispered something to Tyrone and giggled. Tyrone smiled and nudged her shoulder, then went back to reading the flight magazine in front of him. Linda sat upright, flinging the sleep mask off and pressing the call button again. This time it was a different attendant, a tall man with a crisp accent and clipped speech. "Yes, ma'am," he said flatly. "Do I need to remind you that some passengers are here for rest, not recess?" He didn't answer right away. "Ma'am," he began, "our crew is here to ensure the comfort of all passengers. If you have a specific request, I'd be happy to assist." Lyndon blinked, clearly unused to pushback. "I've made several requests. None of them have been taken seriously." He smiled without warmth. "We'll do our best." She opened her mouth again, but he had already moved on. Madison shifted slightly and looked at Tyrone. "She's not letting this go." "She doesn't have anything else in her life to manage," he said without looking up. "This is her battlefield. Let her fight herself." Madison wanted to agree, but she could feel the tension creeping up the back of her neck, not just because of Linda, but because of the way the whole cabin seemed to be pretending nothing was happening, the way eyes flicked over, then away, the way silence spoke more than words. She leaned toward Elijah and pulled a small snack bag from her purse. "Pretzels," she whispered. He nodded eagerly. As he chewed quietly, she glanced out the window. Below, peaks of snowy mountains rose like jagged spines. Above them, endless blue. She closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about the last time they flew as a family. Chicago, different airline, similar story, different face, different scarf. It always came back to the scarf. She opened her eyes just in time to see Linda twisting around again, this time with exaggerated concern. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," she said, loudly enough for the rows around her to hear. "But some of us are paying for a premium experience. If I'd wanted to fly with children kicking my seat and chattering nonstop, I would have booked economy." Madison didn't speak, but Tyrone did. "You seem very invested in reminding everyone how much you paid," he said evenly, his voice soft but crystal clear. "You want a refund? Take it up with customer service. But don't pretend this is about kids being noisy, when what you really mean is our kids being here at all." The cabin went still. Linda's mouth parted, caught off guard by the directness. Her face flushed with a sudden heat she couldn't mask. "I'm sorry," she said tightly. "I didn't realize comments were being taken so personally." "They always are," Madison said, finally turning to face her. "They always have been." Linda turned back in her seat, seething but silent. The attendant from earlier returned with drinks. He offered Linda a glass of white wine. She took it without saying thank you. Then he turned to Madison and gave her a subtle nod, a silent, "We see you." Madison didn't nod back. But her hand slid over Elijah's, giving it a squeeze. And this time, when Maya laughed quietly at a cartoon on her screen, Madison didn't hush her. "Madison, not once. Let him hear it. Let him feel joy. Let them take up space." Tyrone resumed his reading. Elijah crunched another pretzel. Madison leaned her head gently against the window and closed her eyes again. The plane soared higher, cutting through a line of clouds that shimmered like silk. Somewhere behind the door at the front of the cabin, the pilot had been listening, watching. And soon he decided it was time to speak. Captain Jordan Miller stood just inside the cockpit, one hand resting lightly on the frame as he scanned the cabin from behind the privacy curtain. His uniform was pressed to perfection, shoes polished to a mirror shine, epaulets glinting subtly under the overhead lights. From where he stood he could see about half the first-class section. He could also hear the tone, too calm to be called an argument, too sharp to be dismissed. He'd flown enough flights to know the difference between a routine passenger complaint and a brewing storm masked in polite words. He'd heard Linda Brewster's voice before. Her name had already been radioed into the crew's private comm system before takeoff with a note demanding history of microaggressions, requested full silence, and special service. That wasn't standard language, but the flight lead, Allison, had slipped the note to him before boarding. "She's been on 3 of our routes this year," she whispered, "and every time it's the same. Targets someone, usually someone who doesn't look like her." Captain Miller didn't react then. He simply nodded, adjusted his cap, and walked to the bridge like always. But now, watching the subtle shifts and frozen expressions in the cabin, he knew she'd found her next target. Row 4, the black femme. He could see the father, shoulders squared, one hand gripping the armrest, the other lightly tapping a magazine. The mother, poised, calm, but too still. Her face was turned to the window, but her body told the real story. He'd seen it before, in men and women who've had to hold 1,000 things inside just to make it through a public moment with grace. He stepped back inside the cockpit, shutting the curtain quietly. "How's the cabin?" his co-pilot Vickerson asked, without looking up from the navigation screen. "Uneasy," Captain Miller replied. "Keep an eye on the nav. I might need to step out soon." Back in row 4, Madison blinked slowly at her reflection in the window. Not her face exactly, just the outline. A ghost of herself imposed against the clouds beyond. She could feel her jaw tightening again, her shoulders stiffening. She'd kept her calm, just like always, but her hands, those betrayed her. Elijah had curled up next to her now, thumb resting near his chin, too old to suck it but still comforted by its closeness. His screen had dimmed. He wasn't watching the movie anymore, just thinking. Absorbing. And that was what made her angry. Not Linda's tone, not even the suggestion that her family didn't belong. What cut deepest was how her children, especially Elijah, were learning, again, that someone would look at their joy and see offense, that someone would hear their questions and call it noise. Tyron leaned slightly toward her, eyes still forward. "You good?" he asked quietly. "I'm trying," Madison whispered. It's not her words, it's their eyes. Everyone else pretending they don't hear her. That's what gets me. He gave a tiny nod, his expression unreadable. They're watching us more than her, hoping we react first. And we never do, which is why she keeps trying. Across the aisle, Maya was writing in the travel journal Madison had packed for her, a habit she'd started 2 years ago. She was sketching something now, lines and clouds and tiny airplane windows. She'd drawn a woman with an angry mouth in the row ahead, and in the row behind, a family holding hands. Madison looked at it and smiled. Then Maya flipped the page and started over. Behind them, a pair of passengers 2 rows down had been whispering, a man in a gray suit and a woman with tight blonde curls. Madison could hear bits of it. "Well, I mean," the woman said, not really lowering her voice, "kids in first class is just not ideal." "They're not being loud," the man responded, "but, yeah, it's not what you expect up here." That phrase, "up here," rang in Madison's ears like a bell. She turned slightly and caught the man's eye. He looked away. A third attendant passed by, offering another round of drinks. She slowed as she reached row 4, eyes flicking between Madison, then Linda. "Would you like anything else, ma'am?" she asked Linda with automatic courtesy. "A pillow," Linda replied curtly. "And an apology would be nice." The attendant paused. "An apology?" "For the disrespect," Linda said, lifting her chin. "And the attitude." The attendant nodded once, then turned to Madison. "And for you, ma'am?" Madison looked at her. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then, finally, she asked, "Do you have sparkling water?" "Yes," the attendant said. "Lime or plain?" "Light." The woman nodded and left. No sigh, no comment. Just a request. That's all Madison wanted in return? To be treated like anyone else. Captain Miller re-emerged 10 minutes later. He stepped through the curtain with a measured pace, his hat now off, tucked under his arm. He moved slowly through the aisle, not with urgency, but with presence. Every head turned. He stopped briefly at the flight attendant's station, whispered something to Allison, then continued forward until he reached Linda's row. "Mrs. Brewster?" he asked. She turned, already softening at the sight of a uniform. "Yes?" "I'm Captain Miller. I understand there's been some concern from you during the flight." "Well," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I wouldn't call it concern so much as frustration. It's just, I feel like I've been very patient. The family behind me. It's been non-stop since boarding. And I'm a very loyal customer. I fly Monarch exclusively. I just expected a certain level of decorum." Captain Miller nodded once, then glanced back. Madison met his eyes. There was something steady in his gaze. Not pity, not discomfort. Something else. Recognition. "I appreciate you bringing this to our attention," he said. "I would just like it resolved," Linda added. Captain Miller turned fully now, looking down at Madison, then at Tyrone, then at Maya and Elijah. And then, with perfect clarity, he said, "That family you're referring to?" He paused. "That's my captain's family." Lyndon blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Captain Miller didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. He simply looked at her, calmly, as silence settled like fog. "They've been nothing but respectful," he added. "And we hold all our guests to the same standards, but we also hold ourselves to the standard of respect." Linda's mouth opened slightly, then closed. The woman in the blonde curls 2 rows down lowered her eyes. The man beside her shifted uncomfortably in his seat. No one clapped. There were no cheers. But the air changed. It felt lighter. Captain Miller turned to Madison again, gave her a short, respectful nod. She returned it, a silent thank you. He moved back down the aisle and disappeared through the curtain, leaving behind the scent of cologne and the weight of truth. Madison turned to Elijah. He was staring at her, eyes wide. "Was that the pilot?" he whispered. She smiled. "That was the captain." Maya smiled across the aisle, hugging her journal to her chest. Tyrone chuckled, shaking his head. "That was the most polite shutdown I've ever seen." "I know," Madison whispered. She felt it in her chest. Not relief, not victory, but something close to being seen. Just once, without having to raise her voice. The plane continued soaring, a straight line across the sky. And for the first time that flight, Madison closed her eyes, not to shut the world out, but to rest. For real. Linda Brewster didn't speak for a long while. She sat rigidly upright in her seat, her spine straight as a rail, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her scarf, now slightly off-center, slipped to one shoulder, but she made no move to adjust it. Her fingers twitched once, then again. But still she said nothing. The cabin around her had grown quieter, in a different way now, not from a lack of sound, but from the absence of tension. The passengers who had been watching with quiet curiosity were now back to their screens, their books, their glasses of sparkling wine. But ever so often someone glanced up, not at Linda, not at the Oakleys, but forward toward the cockpit door. Captain Jordan Miller had returned behind the curtain, and yet the echo of his words still hovered in the air. "That's my captain's family." Madison didn't gloat. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't smirk, didn't even so much as glance toward Linda. There was no satisfaction in what had happened, only a weight lifted. A moment passed, the kind you carry with you, not because it hurt, but because, for once, it didn't. Tyrone quietly handed Maya a cookie from the snack tray. Madison reached for a blanket and tucked it gently around Elijah, who had finally begun to relax again. His shoulders dropped, his fingers no longer twitching in his lap. He rested his head against her arm, his eyes half-lidded, not quite ready for sleep but floating close. Madison leaned into him slightly and whispered, "You doing okay?" "Yeah," he breathed. She smiled. "Good." But a few rows back, unease still simmered. The woman with the tight blonde curls and the man in the gray suit whispered now with more urgency, their words shorter, clipped. She had stopped commenting, and instead tapped nervously at the rim of her wineglass. "Do you think he really meant it?" the woman whispered. The man shrugged. "Why would he lie?" "I don't know, it's just... If that's the captain's family, then maybe they do belong here," he finished. The woman bit her lip, then nodded stiffly. "I suppose." They didn't look forward again for the rest of the flight. Linda finally moved. Her hand reached out toward the call button once more, but she paused halfway. Her finger hovered in the air. She lowered it slowly and instead pulled a book from her tote. It was a hardback, something historical and beige, the kind of book meant more for appearance than enjoyment. She opened it to the middle and stared at the page without blinking. Madison noticed. Not because she was watching, but because she could feel it, the heat of resentment that always came after entitlement met resistance. Linda's silence wasn't surrender, it was fury. But this time, it had nowhere to go. She looked out the window instead, where the clouds had begun to break, revealing streaks of ocean far below. Across the aisle, Maya turned to her father and asked, "Can we go to the cockpit when we land?" Tyrone smiled. "Maybe, if they allow visitors." "Captain Miller's really nice," Maya said. "He talked like he wasn't scared of anybody." "That's because he isn't," Tyrone replied. "He's got his job and he knows who he is. That kind of peace makes people strong." Maya nodded, her journal still clutched to her chest. She opened it again, this time sketching a different scene. A pilot standing between rows of passengers, his arms out like wings. She labeled him Captain in block letters and then drew a heart beside his name. Madison glanced over and smiled. "That's beautiful, sweetie." Maya grinned. "He looked like a superhero." Tyrone leaned back in his seat, adjusting the headrest. "He kind of was, huh?" And in that moment, things felt simple again. But 30 minutes later, Linda raised her hand. This time, she didn't press the call button. She simply raised her hand, slowly, deliberately, like a student asking for a retest. Allison, the lead flight attendant, approached with careful steps. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, her voice polite but guarded. "I'd like to file a complaint," Linda said, her words slow and precise. "Not about the family, about the captain." Allison didn't blink. "The captain?" "Yes," Linda said, adjusting her scarf with a quick tug. "I felt it was highly inappropriate for him to single me out and take sides in a passenger disagreement. I paid full fare. I've flown Monarch for years. That sort of conduct undermines the neutrality of the airline." Allison paused. "Ma'am, the captain addressed a situation that was creating discomfort for multiple passengers." Linda's voice grew colder. "I wasn't causing a disruption. I was asking for peace, and I find it highly inappropriate that he declared a personal relationship with passengers mid-flight." Allison held her ground. "Captain Miller acted within his discretion, and with all due respect, ma'am, there's a difference between peace and exclusion." Linda's lips tightened into a thin line. "I'll be following up with corporate." "You're welcome to do that," Allison said, still calm. "Would you like me to provide the customer service number?" "No need," Linda replied. "I have it saved." She turned her head sharply, ending the conversation. Allison took one step back, then turned toward Madison and smiled. "Would you or your children like a snack box?" she asked, warmth returning to her voice. Madison blinked in surprise. "Sure, thank you." "I'll bring one for each of you." Elijah looked up. "With crackers?" "Who's crackers?" Allison said. Madison chuckled under her breath. "I think you've made his day." "Glad to hear it," the attendant said. "It's the least we can do." When Allison returned with the boxes, Elijah practically beamed. "This one even has the gummy bears," he whispered, opening it carefully like treasure. Maya giggled beside him. "Can I trade my raisins for your gummies?" "No way. I gave you my cookie last time." Madison smiled as they bartered snacks with the seriousness of Wall Street brokers. She leaned back again, watching the clouds shift to soft orange as the sun began to set on the horizon. The glow painted the cabin in light, no longer sterile white, but warm, golden, peaceful. Tyrone reached across the aisle and squeezed her hand. "You didn't have to say a word," he said softly. "I didn't want to," she replied. "But you could have." "Yeah," she whispered, "and I still might." Their eyes met, and for a moment nothing needed to be said. They both knew the kind of restraint it took to endure moments like these, the kind of strength it took to stay composed. Not for survival, but for dignity. A few rows ahead, Linda shifted again in her seat. She closed her book, stared forward, said nothing. For once she was at the center of the space she occupied. And Madison, quiet, warm, present, had made more of an impact without raising her voice than Linda had with all her words. the captain's family. That phrase would stay with every passenger, even if they never repeated it out loud, because respect, when spoken with conviction, lands harder than shame ever could. And sometimes, the most powerful stand is the one taken without leaving your seat. 35,000 feet in the air and everything finally felt still. Not the kind of stillness that came from silence, but the kind that settled in the bones after a storm passes. Quiet, sturdy, earned. The turbulence had gone, both in the air and in the aisle, and for the first time since takeoff, Madison let her eyes close without pressure behind them. Elijah was asleep now, his hand wrapped loosely around the edge of her sweater, his tiny chest rising and falling against her arm. Madison had always loved the way children could fall asleep anywhere when they felt safe, no matter the altitude, the noise, the history behind someone's eyes. Peace wasn't something you told them to feel. It was something you showed them, over and over again, until they believed it was theirs to keep. Tyrone reached across the aisle and handed her his water. She took it, nodded, and sipped. Across from her, Maya was still sketching. The girl had now added more color to her drawing, soft orange flooding the windows, light pouring over the rows. She had drawn Madison with a little crown of curls, and beside her, Elijah holding a snack box like a trophy. In front of them, a woman with a sour expression had been replaced with a blank outline, erased. Maya didn't say anything. She just kept drawing. That was her way. The captain's voice came over the intercom a few minutes later, calm and steady as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Miller speaking. We're at cruising altitude and the weather looks smooth for the next leg of our journey. Estimated arrival is on schedule just over an hour from now. I'd like to thank you all for your patience, especially those traveling with families. At Monarch, we value respect and comfort for every single guest aboard. And as always, our flight crew is here to ensure this experience is safe, dignified, and welcoming to all." There was a pause, just long enough to let the weight of his words settle. "Thank you for flying with us." Then the speaker went silent. Madison's lips parted just slightly. Not a smile, not surprise, just quiet acknowledgement. Tyrone murmured, "That wasn't in the script." "No," she said softly. "That came from him." In the row ahead, Linda adjusted in her seat again. She didn't look back. She didn't speak. But her posture had changed. No longer the rigid, unshakable woman from earlier. Now she looked like someone holding on to the last thread of a performance long after the audience had stopped clapping. The man in the gray suit leaned over to the woman beside him and said something Madison couldn't hear. Whatever it was, the woman nodded with a faint, guilty expression, folding her arms tighter across her chest. They weren't whispering as much now. There was no longer a safe space for side remarks, not after the captain had spoken out loud what so many were afraid to name. A few rows back, a young woman, college-aged, with tight curls and wide eyes, smiled toward Madison. Not intrusive, not pitying, just a gentle, silent gesture that said, "I saw it. I saw you. Thank you." Madison nodded once in return. She wasn't used to being thanked for sitting still, for being quiet, for not reacting, but that was the strange balance black women learn to walk every day, to bear the weight of other people's comfort while holding their own ground. And today, somehow, that weight had shifted off her shoulders just a little. The lights in the cabin dimmed to a soft glow as dinner service began. The smell of warm bread and seasoned vegetables filled the space, comforting and almost homelike. Madison hadn't realized how hungry she was until her stomach gave a polite protest. Allison returned with a smile. "Chicken or pasta, Mrs. Oakley?" "Pasta, please, and thank you for everything earlier." The flight attendant's smile didn't falter. "Of course. And just so you know, the captain asked if you'd like a quick visit to the cockpit after we land, for the kids, if they're interested." Madison blinked. "Seriously?" He said it was the least he could do. She smiled. "They'll love that, especially Elijah. I'll let him know." Ellison moved to the next row. Linda glanced up from her book, the same page she'd been pretending to read for nearly an hour. She didn't say anything. She just watched. And Madison let her. Byron opened his tray, peeled back the foil from his meal, and raised an eyebrow. Think she's gonna file that complaint? She might, Madison said. People like that don't know how to be invisible. Oh, wrong. She picked at her food thoughtfully, then added, but I don't think she expected anyone to say something, especially not someone like him. The captain? Yeah. White, male, in charge, uniform. You know the type. Tyrone smirked. Yeah, but not the usual type. No, Madison agreed. Not at all. She looked over at Elijah, still sleeping peacefully beside her, and let herself smile fully this time. He didn't just defend us, she added. He affirmed us. Tyrone nodded. That's rare. That's why it mattered. As the flight progressed, conversations began to shift. The man in the gray suit eventually struck up a small-talk discussion with a young man across the aisle. Someone laughed a few rows back. A pair of elderly women asked to take a picture with the sunset through the window. The atmosphere had changed, not just because of what had happened, but because someone had named what had happened. It was like a shared breath everyone had finally taken together. One row ahead, Linda finally spoke, but not to anyone in particular. She turned slightly, addressing a passing attendant with a voice too quiet to carry. I'd like to decline the dessert, she said, her tone suddenly subdued. The attendant looked puzzled. It's complimentary, ma'am. I'm watching my sugar, she said. But the truth was in her eyes. She didn't want sweetness, not tonight, not after what had been served to her already. Madison leaned her head back against the seat and breathed deeply, finally feeling the full stretch of the cabin around her. The hum of the engines faded into a kind of white noise she hadn't heard at takeoff. It wasn't just mechanical. It was harmony. Still imperfect, still flawed, but better. The sunset deepened, casting the clouds in velvet red and gold, painting everything in shades of closure. Beside her, Elijah stirred. Are we there yet? He mumbled sleepily. Almost, baby, Madison whispered, brushing a hand across his forehead. We're almost there. The cabin lights had been turned low, casting a soft blue across the rows as the final descent began. A quiet announcement echoed through the overhead speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now beginning our descent into Raleigh-Durham. Please fasten your seatbelts and return your tray tables to the upright position. Elijah rubbed his eyes, waking just as the plane dipped gently through the first layer of clouds. Madison leaned down and kissed the top of his head. We're almost home, sweetheart. Was I asleep for long? He murmured. Long enough to miss dinner, a movie, and a whole sunset, she teased, tucking the blanket around his legs. Did I snore? A little. Maya giggled from across the aisle. I did not. Yes, you did, she insisted, holding up her tablet with a voice memo as proof. Tyrone chuckled. Busted. Elijah groaned and buried his face in Madison's arm. No. As the plane descended, Madison glanced out the window. The city lights below twinkled like scattered diamonds across a dark velvet cloth. It was a beautiful view, the kind that reminded her why she loved flying, despite everything. Up here, with nothing but clouds and altitude around her, she felt both small and powerful. It was where she found clarity. She reached for Elijah's hand and gave it a small squeeze. Linda had been silent ever since the captain's announcement over the intercom. Her posture remained upright, her movements mechanical. Even now, as the plane began its slow tilt toward the runway, she didn't ask for assistance, didn't make eye contact, didn't utter a single passive-aggressive complaint. Her book remained open, but unread. She'd lost her audience, and without it, the performance no longer had purpose. The tires touched down with a soft jolt. The cabin swayed slightly, then steadied. A round of polite applause followed, mostly from the middle rows, before fading into seatbelt clicks and shuffled belongings. Madison remained still for a moment, letting the final landing hum settle inside her chest. Tyrone was already up, pulling their small carry-on from the overhead. Maya buckled her backpack and slung it over one shoulder. Elijah, still groggy, stood slowly with Madison's help. The ding of the seatbelt sign turning off was met with a flurry of motion. Linda stood with a stiff posture, smoothing her scarf and straightening the lapels of her coat. She didn't turn, didn't glance back, didn't say a word. She stepped into the aisle with the silent poise of someone who had lost control of a moment and didn't know how to reclaim it. Madison didn't follow her immediately. She waited, not because she was avoiding her, but because she was in no rush. For once, the weight was not on her shoulders to navigate someone else's discomfort. One by one, the other passengers filed out, some casting brief glances her way. A few nodded subtly, acknowledgments without words. She accepted them quietly, gracefully. They were not applause, not validation, but recognition. When their row cleared, Allison appeared again, her smile just as warm as before. "Captain Miller is waiting at the cockpit," she said softly. "He'd love to meet the kids if you're still up for it." Elijah's eyes lit up instantly. "Really? For real?" "For real," Allison said. Maya's grip tightened on her sketchbook. "Can I show him my drawing?" "I think he'd love that." Madison nodded, her heart full. "Let's go." The family made their way forward through the aisle, stepping over the dim glow of lights lining the floor. The aircraft felt different now. Calmer, more open, as if something heavy had been released. At the cockpit, the door stood open. Captain Jordan Miller was waiting just outside, one hand resting on the wall, his uniform still perfect, his expression warm and easy. "Hey there," he said, crouching slightly to Elijah's level. "You're Elijah, right?" Elijah nodded, his mouth open in awe. "You're the pilot?" "Sure am." "You fly the whole plane by yourself?" "Well, I've got a great co-pilot helping me. But yep, I'm the one steering us through the sky." Elijah's jaw dropped. "That's awesome." Captain Miller chuckled. "It is." Maya stepped forward and offered her journal, eyes wide and hopeful. "I drew this for you," she said. He took it gently, examining the image. A cartoon version of him, arms outstretched, cape behind him, airplane overhead. "That's incredible," he said. "You're very talented." Maya beamed. Madison stepped forward last, meeting his eyes with a quiet, steady gaze. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with meaning. "Not just for the flight." Captain Miller shook his head gently. "No need to thank me. Some things don't deserve silence." She nodded, her throat tight. He added, "Your family carries something people need to see more of. Grace under pressure. Dignity without a word. That kind of strength sticks with people." Madison smiled, humbled. "We're just tired of apologizing for existing." He nodded. "You shouldn't have to." Behind them, another attendant signaled that it was time to deplane. The Oakleys stepped into the jet bridge, the cold, artificial light greeting them after the dim blue of the cabin. Maya held Madison's hand tightly, Elijah bouncing slightly with each step. As they reached the terminal, a few airport staff smiled as the children passed. One of them pointed at Maya's drawing as she clutched it proudly. A moment of innocence. A soft reminder that the world could still be sweet. They exited into the terminal where families reunited, travelers hurried, and life moved on, unaware of what had unfolded mid-air. Tyrone looked at Madison and said, "You feel that?" He tilted her head. That shift, like something real, just happened. and no one can unsee it. Madison nodded. Yeah, I feel it. The kids raced ahead toward the baggage carousel, chasing each other through the mostly empty space. Madison watched them go, her heart filled to the edges, but not overflowing. Just full. The way it should be. As they waited for their luggage, an older woman with a cane shuffled over slowly. She looked hesitant at first, as if unsure whether to speak. Madison offered a polite smile. The woman leaned in slightly and said, "You handled that beautifully, dear. I saw the whole thing, and I just wanted to say, I learned something today." Madison's eyes softened. "Thank you." The woman nodded and walked away. Tyrone bumped her gently with his elbow. "Maybe this flight wasn't just for us." "Maybe not," she replied. The conveyor belt hummed to life. Suitcases circled. Elijah shrieked, "I see ours!" And just like that, life kept moving. But something had changed. A moment in the sky had grounded something deeper. No headlines, no cameras, just a mother, her family, a challenge, and a choice. And in the end, the quietest voices had spoken the loudest. They rolled their bags out of the terminal, past the bustling arrivals, into the humid night air. Madison inhaled deeply, letting the breath settle all the way down to her bones. And for once, the world around her felt just a little bit lighter. They were home. Ask ChatGPT.